Off from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. In 36 hours, they transport 14,325 people directly to Israel. This was not a military operation. This was not a refugee crisis. This was the fulfillment of a 2,700-year-old prophecy. The people on those planes were Ethiopian Jews, Beta Israel. They had preserved their identity for more than 27 centuries. They kept Torah. They observed Shabbat. They faced Jerusalem and prayed for a return that seemed impossible. Isaiah named their location, Cush. He said a remnant would return from there in the final gathering. These flights were called Operation Solomon, but they were more than an operation. They were evidence, and they were just the beginning, because 7 other groups were already moving, from 7 other locations Isaiah named. The prophecy is in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11. Most people read it once and move on, but one phrase in that verse changes everything. Isaiah wrote that the Lord would recover his people a second time, not once, twice, 2 separate returns, 2 different eras, 2 distinct fulfillments. The first return was from Babylon. That happened in 538 BC under Cyrus the Persian, documented in history, recorded in Scripture, fulfilled completely. But Isaiah did not stop there. He pointed to another gathering, one that would happen long after Babylon, one that would involve not one empire, but many nations, not one direction, but 8 locations spread across continents. He named them Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Kush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath, and the islands of the sea. 8 locations, 8 points of the compass. 8 anchors of a global dispersion. For centuries, this list seemed like ancient geography, names of places that no longer mattered. But every name on that list corresponds to a real community that either has already returned to Israel or is in the process of returning right now. That is not interpretation. That is a record. The Ethiopian Jews came from Cush, exactly where Isaiah said. The Iraqi and Kurdish Jews came from ancient Babylon and Assyria, exactly where Isaiah said. The Yemeni Jews came from the Arabian Peninsula, connected to the islands of the sea, exactly where Isaiah said. Jews from India, from the Bnei Menashe community, trace their lineage to the tribe of Manasseh, scattered into the Far East, regions Isaiah pointed to when he wrote about lands beyond Israel's borders. North African Jews returned from Egypt and Libya, ancient Pathros. Persian Jews came from Iran, ancient Elam. Each location Isaiah named has produced a returning remnant. Not in theory, in measurable movements, flights, border crossings, documented arrivals, government records, population data. This is not symbolic fulfillment. This is physical relocation on a global scale. But here is what makes the timing critical. For 2,500 years, nothing happened. The Babylonian return occurred. The second return did not. Empires rose and fell. Borders shifted. Entire civilizations collapsed and rebuilt. The Jewish people scattered further. Tribes disappeared from the public record. Languages changed. Cultures absorbed them. And the prophecy sat in the text, untouched, unmoved, waiting. Not because it was unclear, because the conditions did not exist. Isaiah described a return that required international borders, global transportation, multiple nations coordinating movement, and most importantly, a restored nation of Israel capable of receiving the remnant. None of those conditions existed in the ancient world. None of them existed in the Middle Ages. None of them existed during the Ottoman Empire. They did not exist in 1800 or 1900, but in 1948, everything changed. May 14, 1948. Israel became a nation again. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, there was a place for the remnant to return to. A government, a flag, a military, an international identity, legal frameworks, diplomatic recognition. The window opened, and within one generation, the movement began. It started immediately. Jews from Europe who survived the Holocaust, Jews from Arab nations facing persecution, Jews from the Soviet Union when the borders finally cracked open. But the most striking returns were the ones that matched Isaiah's list exactly. The ones that brought back communities no one knew still existed. The ones that proved the prophecy was not symbolic. It was a blueprint. Operation Magic Carpet brought Yemeni Jews in the late 1940s. They had lived in isolation for centuries. They preserved traditions that dated back to the First Temple period, when the planes arrived to bring them to Israel. Many had never seen an aircraft before. Some believed they were fulfilling the verse in Exodus, "I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." They boarded the planes, thousands of them, and they returned to a land their ancestors had left more than 2,500 years earlier. Operation Ezra and Nehemiah evacuated Iraqi Jews in the early 1950s. Iraq had been home to one of the oldest continuous Jewish communities in the world, ancient Babylon, the place where the first exile occurred. When Iraq's government turned hostile, Israel airlifted more than 120,000 Jews in a covert operation. They came from the land of the first captivity, fulfilling the pattern Isaiah described. Soviet Jews began returning when the USSR collapsed. For decades, they were trapped behind closed borders, prevented from emigrating, cut off from Jewish practice. Their identity was suppressed. When the system fell, more than 1 million Soviet Jews moved to Israel, the largest single wave of immigration in the nation's modern history. They came from the north, from territories that align with the ancient lands Isaiah referenced. Then there was Ethiopia. The Beta Israel community had a unique story. They were isolated for more than 2 millennia. No contact with the broader Jewish world, no rabbis from Europe or the Middle East, no Talmudic tradition in the way other communities practiced it. But they had the Torah, they had the dietary laws, they had the Sabbath, they had the festivals, and they had something else, an annual observance called Sigd. For more than 2,000 years, they gathered on mountaintops in Ethiopia. They fasted. They prayed. They renewed their covenant with God. And they asked for one thing: to return to Jerusalem. They did not pray as if it were symbolic. They prayed as if it were literal, as if one day the promise would be fulfilled and they would stand in the land their ancestors left. Generation after generation kept this observance. They faced toward Jerusalem from the highlands of Ethiopia. They waited, and on May 24, 1991, the wait ended. Operation Solomon was not the first evacuation. Operation Moses in 1984 had already brought thousands, but Solomon was larger, faster, more urgent. Ethiopia was collapsing into civil war. The Beta Israel were trapped in the middle. Israel coordinated with international authorities and launched the largest airlift in the nation's history. 35 planes, 36 hours, more than 14,000 people. They removed seats from the aircraft to fit more passengers. Families boarded with nothing but the clothes they wore. Some women gave birth mid-flight. When the planes landed in Israel, the passengers stepped onto the soil their ancestors had prayed toward for 27 centuries. They were home, not because of politics, not because of humanitarian policy, because Isaiah 11:11 said the Lord would gather his people from Cush a second time. Cush is Ethiopia. The remnant returned. The prophecy moved from the page into the present. Now here is the part that makes this more than history. The Ethiopian return is not isolated. It is part of a pattern. Every location Isaiah named has produced a returning group. Some have already completed the journey. Others are in process. But all of them emerged after 1948. All of them within one generation. All of them from places that align geographically with Isaiah's list. And all of them carried something with them. Traditions, languages, customs, genetic markers. Oral histories that link them to the ancient tribes. These were not random refugees searching for a better life. These were remnants, preserved, hidden, scattered for centuries. And when the time came, they moved. Not because someone organized it from the outside, because the prophecy required it. This raises a question that cannot be avoided. If Isaiah's second gathering has already begun, what else is about to unfold? Because Isaiah does not stop at verse 11. The chapter continues. After describing the global return, Isaiah writes about what comes next. He describes tension between Israel and surrounding nations. He describes the reunification of the northern and southern kingdoms. He describes a root from Jesse, who will stand as a banner to the nations. He describes a moment when the knowledge of the Lord covers the earth like waters cover the sea. The gathering is not the end of the timeline. It is the setup. It marks the transition from one phase of prophecy to the next. And if the gathering is complete, or nearly complete, then the next sequence must be approaching. But before we move forward, we need to go back. Back to the moment when Isaiah received this prophecy. Back to the details most readers skip. Back to the reason why a second time is one of the most important phrases in the entire prophetic record. Because once you understand what the first return looked like, you will see why the second return could not happen in any previous generation. And why is it happening now? The phrase appears in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11. And it shall come to pass on that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people. The second time, two words that create a division in the timeline. If there is a second time, there must be a first time. Isaiah knew exactly what he was writing. He was not being poetic. He was being precise. The first return was Babylon. The second return would be global. Isaiah began his ministry around 740 BC. He served during the reigns of 4 kings of Judah: Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah. His prophetic career spanned more than 40 years. He witnessed the collapse of the northern kingdom. He saw Assyria rise. He watched as the southern kingdom of Judah teetered on the edge of destruction. And during that time, God gave him messages, not just for his generation, for generations far beyond his own. One of those messages concerned Babylon. At the time Isaiah prophesied about Babylon, Babylon was not yet a world power. Assyria dominated the region. Babylon was secondary, a vassal, not a threat. But Isaiah said Babylon would rise. He said Babylon would destroy Jerusalem. He said the people of Judah would be taken captive. And he said they would return. This was not a vague prediction. It was detailed. Isaiah chapter 39 records the moment when envoys from Babylon visited King Hezekiah. Hezekiah showed them everything. the treasury, the armory, the wealth of the kingdom. Isaiah confronted him. He told Hezekiah that everything he showed the Babylonians would one day be carried off to Babylon. Nothing would be left. Then he said this, "And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." Hezekiah's response is telling. He said, "The word of the Lord you have spoken is good." Why? Because he knew it would not happen in his lifetime. But it would happen. In 605 BC, Babylon began its conquest of Judah. King Nebuchadnezzar invaded. He took captives back to Babylon, including Daniel and his companions. In 597 BC, he returned. He took more captives, including the prophet Ezekiel. In 586 BC, he destroyed Jerusalem completely. The temple was burned. The walls were torn down. The remaining population was deported. Everything Isaiah said would happen, happened, exactly as written. The captivity lasted 70 years, not 69, not 71, 70. Jeremiah had prophesied the exact duration, 70 years, and in 538 BC it ended. Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC. He was a Persian king, not Jewish, not a worshipper of Yahweh, a pagan ruler by Israel's standards. But Isaiah had already named him, 150 years before he was born. Isaiah chapter 44, verse 28. Who says of Cyrus, "He is my shepherd, and will accomplish all that I please. He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundations be laid." Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of, to subdue nations before him. The prophecy named the king. It described his action. It gave the outcome. And it all happened exactly as written. Cyrus issued a decree in 538 BC. The decree is recorded in two places, Ezra chapter 1 in the Bible, and the Cyrus cylinder, discovered in 1879 in Babylon. The cylinder is a clay artifact inscribed with Cyrus's proclamation. It describes his policy of allowing conquered peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. The Bible records the specific decree concerning the Jews. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord their God be with them." The Jews were free to return, and they did. Not all of them, but a remnant. Zerubbabel led the first group, nearly 50,000 people. They returned to Jerusalem. They rebuilt the altar. They laid the foundation of the temple. Later, Ezra returned with another group. Then Nehemiah came and rebuilt the walls. The return from Babylon was complete. The prophecy was fulfilled. This establishes the pattern. Prophecy given. Centuries pass. Conditions align. Fulfillment occurs, exactly as written. The first return was not symbolic. It was literal. Isaiah did not mean spiritual Babylon. He meant the actual city. He did not mean a symbolic return. He meant physical relocation. And when Isaiah wrote about a second return, he used the same language, the same structure, the same precision. If the first return was literal, the second return must be literal. If the first return involves real geography, the second return involves real geography. If the first return was measurable, the second return is measurable. The pattern does not change. But here is the key difference. The first return was local. One empire, one direction. One group was taken to one location and brought back. The second return is global. Isaiah lists 8 locations, not 1, 8. He does not say from Babylon. He says from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. This is not one captivity. This is dispersion across continents. This is not one empire releasing captives. This is multiple nations, multiple governments, multiple political systems, all involved in the same movement. The first return required one king to issue one decree. The second return required conditions that did not exist until the 20th century. No ancient empire had the reach. Babylon controlled the Fertile Crescent. Persia expanded that reach. Greece spread further. Rome covered the Mediterranean. But none of them spanned the continents Isaiah described. None of them had aircraft to move people across oceans. None of them had international law to recognize the right of return. None of them had communication systems to coordinate global movement. And most importantly, none of them had a restored nation of Israel to receive the remnant. The second return could not happen in the time of Cyrus, or Alexander, or Caesar, or Constantine, or the Ottomans. It could only happen after 1948. That is why the phrase, "a second time," matters. It separates 2 events, 2 eras, 2 stages of the same plan. The first stage validated the prophetic structure. It proved that God says what he means and does what he says. The second stage operates on the same principle, same God, same precision, same fulfillment pattern, but on a larger scale, longer timeline, greater complexity. Isaiah saw both returns. He wrote about both. He separated them with language that cannot be ignored. The first time, Babylon. The second time, the 4 corners of the earth. The first return brought back those taken by one empire. The second return gathers those scattered by many. And the second return has begun. We are not waiting for it. We are watching it. The flights from Ethiopia were not random humanitarian efforts. They were the fulfillment of the second gathering. The airlifts from Yemen. The evacuations from Iraq. The mass immigration from the former Soviet Union. The quiet returns from India and North Africa. Each movement fits the pattern Isaiah described. Each group comes from a location Isaiah named. Each wave occurred after the nation was restored in 1948. The prophecy is not dormant. It is active. The timeline is not theoretical. It is measurable. The second time is now. But if the gathering is already underway, what does that mean for the rest of the prophecy? Isaiah does not stop at verse 11. He continues. He describes what happens after the remnant returns. He describes conflict, division, regional tension. He describes a figure who rises as a banner to the nations. He describes a moment when the earth is filled with the knowledge of the Lord. The gathering is not the conclusion. It is the setup. It positions the pieces on the board. And once the pieces are in place, the next phase begins. That next phase involves something most people thought would never happen. The temple. For 2,000 years, there has been no temple in Jerusalem. The second temple was destroyed by Rome in 70 AD. The site has been occupied by Islamic structures since the 7th century. The idea of rebuilding seemed impossible, politically unthinkable, religiously inflammatory. But something has shifted. The temple is no longer discussed as a distant dream. It is discussed as a practical question. Organizations exist that are preparing for it. Vessels have been made. Priests have been trained. Plans have been drawn. The conversation has changed. And the change happened at the same time the remnant began returning. That is not a coincidence. That is the sequence. Isaiah's second return prophecy seemed impossible for one simple reason. The people disappeared. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. 10 tribes vanished from the historical record after the Assyrian invasion of 722 BC. They were removed from their land, separated from each other, pushed into regions far beyond the borders of Israel. And for more than 2,700 years, they were gone. The northern kingdom fell in stages. First, the Assyrians took the eastern tribes, Reuben, Gad, half of Manasseh. Then they invaded deeper. They conquered the Galilee region. They took Naphtali. Finally, in 722 BC, they destroyed Samaria, the capital. The remaining tribes were deported. Ephraim, Issachar, Zebulun, Asher, Dan, the other half of Manasseh. The Assyrian policy was brutal and effective. They did not just conquer. They erased. They took entire populations and relocated them across the empire. Then they brought in foreign peoples to settle the conquered lands. The goal was to prevent rebellion, to destroy national identity, to make sure the conquered people could never reorganize. It worked. The 10 tribes disappeared. The Bible records what happened, but not where they went. 2 Kings chapter 17 describes the fall. It says the Assyrians carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them in Hala and in Habor by the river of Gozan and in the cities of the Medes. Those are place names, real locations, but vague, spread across a wide territory. Hala was in northern Mesopotamia. Habor was along the Kabur River in modern Syria. Gozan was nearby. The cities of the Medes were further east, in what is now Iran. The tribes were scattered across hundreds of miles. Different regions, different populations, different rulers, and that was just the initial placement. Over time, they moved further. Some migrated south. Some went east. Some were pushed into Central Asia. Others went north toward the Caucasus. Within a few generations, they were spread across continents, and the historical record stopped tracking them. This is why the prophecy seemed impossible. Isaiah said the remnant would return from Assyria, from Elam, from Shinar, from the islands of the sea, but by Isaiah's time, those locations were already beyond reach. How could they return if no one knew where they were? How could they preserve identity after being absorbed into foreign cultures? How could they maintain language, customs, and lineage across 27 centuries? The task seemed beyond possibility, and for most of history, nothing suggested it could happen. But Isaiah did not call them lost. He called them the remnant. That distinction matters. A remnant is not gone. A remnant is preserved. The word remnant implies intention. Something that remains after everything else is removed. Something kept for a purpose. Isaiah used that word deliberately. He was not describing the people who vanished. He was describing people who were hidden. Hidden, but not destroyed. Scattered, but not forgotten. Absorbed into other nations, but not erased. The remnant would endure, and when the time came, the remnant would return. For centuries, the idea remained theoretical. Rabbis debated the fate of the 10 tribes. Some said they were lost forever. Some said they would return in the Messianic age. Some placed them in distant lands beyond the Sambation River, a mythical boundary that could not be crossed. Christian scholars speculated. Some connected them to European peoples. some to Native American tribes, some to groups in Asia or Africa. But no one had evidence, no archaeological discoveries, no historical documents, no verified communities claiming descent from the northern tribes. The 10 tribes remained a mystery, a theological question, a historical puzzle, but not a present reality. Then the 20th century changed everything. Not because scholars solved the mystery, because the remnant started appearing. Communities emerged from isolation, groups that had preserved traditions no one expected, customs that traced back to ancient Israel, oral histories that matched biblical accounts, and they appeared in locations that aligned with Isaiah's list, not randomly, precisely. The first clue came from the direction no one anticipated. Ethiopia. In the highlands of Ethiopia, a community called Beta Israel had lived for more than 2 millennia. They were black Africans. They spoke Ge'ez and Amharic, not Hebrew. They had no contact with European or Middle Eastern Jewish communities, but they practiced a form of Judaism that predated the Talmud. They kept the Torah. They observed Sabbath from Friday evening to Saturday evening. They practiced ritual purity laws. They offered sacrifices until the 20th century. They celebrated Passover, Pentecost, and the Day of Atonement. They did not have Hanukkah. That festival developed after the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BC, long after the Beta Israel were already isolated. They did not have Purim. That commemorates events in Persia during the time of Esther. The Beta Israel had already left. Their practice reflected the religion of Israel before the Babylonian exile, before the development of rabbinic Judaism, before the synagogue system, before the oral law. They preserved what they carried with them when they left. Their origin story was consistent across generations. They said they descended from the tribe of Dan. They said their ancestors left Israel during the time of the Exodus, or shortly after the reign of Solomon. They said they traveled south, following the Nile, and eventually settled in the region of Kush. Cush is the biblical name for the area that includes modern Ethiopia and Sudan. Isaiah listed Cush as one of the locations from which the remnant would return. The Beta Israel were in Cush. They claimed descent from Dan, and they waited for 1,700 years to return. But they were not the only group. In India, another community surfaced, the B'nai Menashe. They lived in the northeastern states of Manipur and Mizoram, near the border with Myanmar. For centuries, they practiced a religion that resembled ancient Israelite worship. They sang songs in a language they did not fully understand. The songs contained Hebrew words. They observed a day of rest. They practiced animal sacrifice. They separated clean and unclean animals according to Levitical law. Their oral tradition said they were descendants of the tribe of Manasseh. They said their ancestors were exiled by the Assyrians, traveled east across Asia, and eventually settled in the mountains of northeastern India. In the 20th century, a few members of the community began studying their traditions more carefully. They compared them to the Hebrew Bible. The match was undeniable. In the 1970s and 1980s, they began formally returning to Jewish practice. In 2005, the chief rabbinate of Israel officially recognized them as descendants of the tribe of Manasseh. Since then, thousands have immigrated to Israel. They came from the east, from lands far beyond Israel's ancient borders, exactly where Isaiah said the remnant would be found. Then there were the Pashtuns. The Pashtun people live in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They number more than 40 million. Among them, certain tribes preserve customs that do not fit their current religion or culture. They practice circumcision on the 8th day. Most Muslims circumcise at age 13. They light candles on Friday evening. No Islamic requirement for this. They wear four-cornered garments with fringes, similar to the Jewish talit. They observe dietary restrictions that resemble kosher law. Their tribal names match the sons of Israel. Yusufzai, sons of Joseph. Afridi, possibly Ephraim, Asher, Gad, Reuben, Simeon. Some Pashtun elders claim descent from the 10 tribes. They say their ancestors were exiled by the Assyrians and settled in the mountains of Central Asia. Genetic studies have found markers among some Pashtun groups that link them to Middle Eastern populations. The evidence is not conclusive, but the pattern is present. And the location matches. Afghanistan and Pakistan sit in the region of ancient Elam and the eastern territories Isaiah referenced. These are not the only examples. Groups in Yemen preserved Jewish identity for centuries. They were airlifted to Israel in Operation Magic Carpet. Kurdish Jews in northern Iraq traced their presence back to the Assyrian exile. They returned in the 1950s. Persian Jews in Iran lived in the cities of the Medes, the exact location mentioned in 2 Kings 17. Thousands have emigrated to Israel since 1948. The Cochin Jews of southern India maintained communities for more than 2,000 years. Most have relocated to Israel. The Kaifeng Jews of China preserved their identity until the 19th century. Some descendants have sought to return. In each case, the community existed in isolation. Each preserved elements of Israelite tradition. Each emerged or strengthened contact with Israel after 1948. And each location corresponds to the regions Isaiah named. This is not folklore. This is a pattern. Different continents, different languages, different appearances, different cultures, but the same traditions, the same direction of origin, the same desire to return, and the same timing. All of these movements accelerated after Israel became a nation again. None of them could have happened before. No structure existed to receive them. No nation claimed them. No government had the authority to bring them home. But once Israel existed, the door opened, and the remnant walked through it. The impossibility was never about God's ability. It was about timing. The prophecy required specific conditions: a restored nation, international borders, global communication, air travel, diplomatic frameworks, legal recognition of the right of return. None of those existed in the ancient world. None existed in the medieval period. None existed in the 19th century. But by the mid-20th century, all of them were in place. The conditions aligned, and the prophecy activated. Isaiah saw this moment 2,700 years before it happened. He could not have known about aircraft, or international law, or genetic testing, or modern communication, but he knew the remnant would return. He knew they would come from multiple directions. He knew the return would be global. He knew it would happen after Israel was restored, and he wrote it down with precision that still holds. The 10 tribes were never lost. They were positioned across the earth so that when the time came, the gathering would be unmistakable. Not from one place, from 8. Not by one method, by many. Not in one decade, across 75 years and counting. The pattern proves the prophecy. The locations confirm the text. The timing validates the timeline. But here is what makes this moment different from every other moment in the last 2,700 years. The remnant is not just moving. The remnant is home. The Beta Israel are in Jerusalem. The B'nai Menashe are in Israel. The Yemeni Jews are there, the Iraqi Jews, the Persian Jews, the Russian Jews. They are not scattered anymore. They are consolidated, and consolidation is not the end of the sequence. It is the preparation for what comes next. Because Isaiah does not end his prophecy with the gathering, he continues with a description of conflict, of realignment, of pressure on the nations, and at the center of that pressure is one city, Jerusalem, the city where a 108-year-old rabbi left a sealed letter. The city where three movements are now converging. The city where the temple once stood and may stand again. The gathering has brought the remnant home. Now, the question is not whether prophecy is real. The question is, what happens when the remnant is in place, and the next phase begins? May 14, 1948, 4:00 p.m. Local time. Tel Aviv Museum. David Ben-Gurion stood before a small gathering and read a declaration. 37 minutes later, Israel existed again. For the first time in 1,878 years, the Jewish people had a nation, not a province, not a protectorate, not a community within someone else's empire. A sovereign state, with borders, a government, a military, international recognition. The declaration was 979 words long. It referenced historical connection to the land. It cited the Balfour Declaration. It acknowledged the Holocaust. It called for peace with neighboring states. But it did not reference the prophecies. It did not mention Isaiah, or Ezekiel, or Jeremiah. The men in that room were largely secular. They were Zionists motivated by political necessity, not religious conviction. They were not trying to fulfill prophecy, but they did. Because the date was not random. Israel declared independence on the 5th of Iyar, 5708 in the Hebrew calendar. The same day the British mandate expired. The British had announced their withdrawal months earlier. They set a deadline, May 14, 1948. The Jewish leadership had to act immediately or lose the opportunity. They did not choose the date for symbolic reasons, but the date chose itself. And when you trace the timeline backward, the precision becomes undeniable. Ezekiel 37 describes a vision of dry bones coming back to life. The bones represent the whole house of Israel, scattered, dead, dried out, no hope of recovery. But God says He will bring them back. He will put flesh on the bones, breath in the bodies, life in the nation. Then He says this in verse 21, I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land. This is not spiritual resurrection. This is national restoration, physical return, geographic consolidation, political sovereignty. The vision describes exactly what began on May 14, 1948. Jeremiah went further. He gave a duration. Jeremiah 29:10 says, When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. That prophecy applied to the Babylonian exile, 70 years, then return. It happened exactly as written. But there is another 70 in Scripture, a longer one. Leviticus 26 describes the consequences of disobedience. It says, the land will enjoy its Sabbath rests while the people are in exile. The land was supposed to rest every 7th year. A Sabbath year. No planting, no harvesting, total rest. Israel did not keep that command. For 490 years they violated the Sabbath year cycle. That meant 70 Sabbath years were owed. 2 Chronicles 36:21 confirms this. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests, All the time of its desolation it rested, until the 70 years were completed. 70 years in Babylon paid the debt for the violated Sabbaths. But Leviticus 26 also describes a longer exile, one that would scatter the people among the nations, one that would last until the land had been paid back fully. Some scholars have calculated the exile in terms of times 7 periods based on Leviticus 26's repetition of 7 times more for disobedience. The math is complex. The interpretations vary. But what is not debatable is this. The nation was scattered for nearly 1,900 years, and it returned in 1948. The timing was not accidental. Within hours of the declaration, 5 Arab armies attacked. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. They declared their intention to destroy the new state before it could establish itself. Israel had no standing army, no heavy weapons, no air force worth the name. The population was small. Many were Holocaust survivors who had arrived with nothing. Every strategic assessment said Israel would lose. But Israel won. Not easily. Not without cost. Thousands died. The fighting lasted more than a year. But when the armistice agreements were signed in 1949, Israel held more territory than the UN partition plan had allocated. The nation survived. Against overwhelming odds. Against multiple armies. Against every reasonable prediction. Survival was not luck. It was a fulfillment. Because Zechariah had already described this moment. Zechariah 12:2-3 says, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem. On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it will injure themselves. Jerusalem did not fall in 1948. The surrounding peoples did attack. They did besiege. They did try to remove the new state, but they failed. And in failing, they injured themselves. The war cost them territory. It cost them credibility. It cost them momentum. Israel did not just survive. It expanded. The prophetic window did not just crack open. It swung wide. And immediately, the movement began. Within months of independence, Jews started returning from nations that had held them for centuries. Operation Magic Carpet launched in 1949. It brought nearly 50,000 Yemeni Jews to Israel in less than a year. They came from a community that had existed since before the destruction of the Second Temple. They lived in isolation. Many had never seen modern technology. When they boarded the planes, some quoted Isaiah 40:31. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They believed the prophecy was being fulfilled in real time. Operation Ezra and Nehemiah followed in the early 1950s. More than 120,000 Iraqi Jews were airlifted out of Baghdad. Iraq had been home to one of the world's oldest Jewish communities, ancient Babylon, the place of the first exile. Now they were leaving Babylon again, not by decree of a Persian king, by flights arranged by a modern state. The symbolism was exact. The first return came from Babylon under Cyrus. The second return included Babylon again. But this time, it was part of a global gathering. The pattern repeated across continents. Jews from North Africa began immigrating. Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Algeria. These were ancient communities. Some traced their origins to the Babylonian exile, others to the Roman destruction, others further back. They came by the thousands, then tens of thousands. By the 1960s, most North African Jewish communities had relocated to Israel. Jews from Eastern Europe arrived in waves: Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, communities that had survived the Holocaust, communities that were now trapped behind the Iron Curtain. When opportunities came, they moved, sometimes legally, often through covert channels. And in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the floodgates opened. More than 1 million Soviet Jews immigrated to Israel between 1989 and 2006. From Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, Central Asia. They came from territories that stretched from Europe to the borders of China. From the north, from the far reaches Isaiah described when he wrote about the lands beyond Israel's ancient borders. The gathering was not symbolic. It was demographic. The nation's population exploded. In 1948, there were 600,000 Jews in Israel. By 2000, there were more than 5 million, not through birth rates alone, through return. But the most striking returns were the ones few expected. Ethiopia in the 1980s and 1990s. India started in the 2000s. Small groups from Peru claiming descent from conversos. Communities in Uganda with Israelite traditions. Groups in Zimbabwe. Descendants of Jews in Suriname and Curaçao. Each wave confirmed the same pattern. Dispersion had been global. The return would be global. Not from one direction. From all directions. Not from one people group. From multiple lineages scattered across centuries. The window opened in 1948, and once it opened, the movement could not be stopped. The window has a name. It is called the Times of the Gentiles. Jesus referenced it in Luke 21:24. He said, "Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." For nearly 1900 years, Jerusalem was controlled by non-Jewish powers. Romans, Byzantines, Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, Mamluks, Ottomans, British. One empire after another. One occupation after another. But in June 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israeli forces captured the old city of Jerusalem. For the first time since 70 AD, Jews controlled the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, the ancient city of David. The commander who led the forces into the old city radioed a message that became legendary. "The Temple Mount is in our hands." That sentence marked a shift, not just military, prophetic. The times of the Gentiles had reached a transition point. Jerusalem was no longer trampled by foreign powers. It was under Jewish sovereignty again. The clock moved forward. And with that movement came a new set of conditions. Conditions that made the next phase possible. Conditions that allowed groups long hidden to re-emerge. Conditions that brought the remnant home. Conditions that set the stage for what no generation before had witnessed. The temple discussion. The Messianic recognition. The regional realignment. All three began to accelerate after 1967. But they could not have happened without 1948. 1948 opened the window. 1967 widened it. And now, more than 75 years later, the window is still open. But it will not stay open forever. Because windows close. Not gradually, suddenly, the Babylonian exile lasted 70 years. Then it ended, abruptly. One decree, one king, 1 year. The Roman exile lasted 1,178 years. Then it ended. One declaration, one date, one moment. Prophetic windows operate on divine timing, not human schedules. They open when conditions align. They close when the purpose is complete. The second gathering is underway. The remnant has returned. The consolidation is measurable. That means the window is nearing its purpose. And when a prophetic window nears its purpose, the next sequence comes into view. That sequence involves three forces converging in Jerusalem. A movement within the Jewish community toward Messianic recognition. A movement toward rebuilding the temple. A movement in the nations surrounding Israel toward conflict. All three are active now. All three were predicted. And all three were set in motion the moment Israel became a nation again in 1948. The date did not fulfill prophecy by accident. It fulfilled prophecy because the time had come. And if 1948 was the opening, the question is not whether the next phase will arrive. The question is whether anyone will recognize it when it does. Every prophetic fulfillment requires evidence. Not interpretation, evidence. Something measurable, verifiable, undeniable. The return from Ethiopia is that evidence. It is not symbolic. It is not spiritual. It is not debatable. It is documented, recorded, witnessed by the world. And it matches Isaiah's prophecy with precision that cannot be dismissed. Isaiah named 8 locations: Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath, islands of the sea. Each name corresponds to a real place, a real direction, a real people group. Cush is not symbolic. It is geographic. In biblical terminology, Cush refers to the region south of Egypt, the area that includes modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia. Ancient maps place it there. Historical records confirm it. Archaeological evidence supports it. Cush is Ethiopia. And Isaiah said the remnant would return from Cush in the second gathering. That prophecy remained dormant for 2,700 years. Then, in 1984, it was activated. The Beta Israel community had lived in Ethiopia for more than 2 millennia. They called themselves Beta Israel, House of Israel. Outsiders called them Falasha, a term they rejected. It means stranger, exile. They were not strangers in their own identity. They knew who they were: descendants of Israel, keepers of the Torah, preservers of the covenant. But they were isolated, cut off from the rest of the Jewish world. No contact with European rabbis, no access to the Talmud, no knowledge of developments in rabbinic Judaism after the Babylonian exile. They practiced a form of Judaism that predated those developments. Their worship centered on the Torah. The first 5 books, the Law of Moses. They observed Sabbath. They kept dietary laws. They practiced ritual purity. They celebrated the biblical festivals: Passover, Pentecost, Day of Atonement, Feast of Tabernacles. But not Hanukkah. That festival began in the 2nd century BC, long after their ancestors had already left. Not Purim. That commemorates events in Persia during the time of Esther. The Beta Israel were already in Ethiopia. Their religious calendar reflected the faith of Israel before the exile, before the oral law, before the synagogue system, before rabbinic authority. They preserved what their ancestors brought with them. Their traditions pointed to the tribe of Dan. The Beta Israel oral history said their ancestors came from the tribe of Dan. They said Dan left Israel and traveled south. Some accounts say it happened during the time of Moses. Others say during the reign of Solomon. The details vary. The direction does not. South, toward Egypt, then deeper, into Cush. The name Dan appears in Ethiopian Jewish tradition. The term Dan is connected to their identity in ways that go beyond coincidence. Genetic studies conducted in recent decades found markers among Beta Israel that link them to Middle Eastern populations, not conclusive proof of tribal descent, but evidence of ancient connection, the tradition, the genetics, the location, the preserved customs. All of it points in the same direction. Dan went to Cush, and in the 1980s, Dan came home. But before the return, there was a practice that proved their expectation. An annual observance unique to Beta Israel. Not found in any other Jewish community, not recorded in Scripture, not mentioned in the Talmud. It was their own tradition, passed down for more than 2,000 years. Sigd means prostration, bowing down. Every year, 50 days after Yom Kippur, the entire community would gather on a mountaintop. They fasted, they prayed, they read from the Torah, they renewed their covenant with God, and they faced toward Jerusalem. For centuries they gathered in the highlands of Ethiopia, on the mountains of Gondar, on hills overlooking their villages. They stood in the direction of a city most of them had never seen. A city their ancestors left 27 centuries earlier. A city they believed they would one day return to. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was an annual declaration of faith. A public statement that their exile was temporary. That God had not forgotten them. That the promise would be fulfilled. Generation after generation kept Sigd. Through famines, through wars, through persecution, through isolation. They never stopped observing it. They never stopped facing Jerusalem. They never stopped believing they would return. And then the conditions changed. In the 1970s, Ethiopia descended into political chaos. Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown in 1974. The Derg, a Marxist military junta, took control. The new regime was brutal. It nationalized land. It suppressed religion. It fought internal rebellions across the country. The Beta Israel were caught in the middle. They lived in rural areas. They had little political power. They were vulnerable. Famine struck in the early 1980s. Hundreds of thousands died across Ethiopia. The Beta Israel were among the hardest hit. At the same time, Israel became aware of their situation. For years, there had been debates within Israel about the Beta Israel. Were they truly Jewish? Should they be allowed to immigrate under the law of return? In 1973, the Sephardic chief rabbi, Ovadia Yosef, issued a ruling. He declared that the Beta Israel were descendants of the tribe of Dan. He said they were Jews and should be brought to Israel. In 1975, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi agreed. The Israeli government began making plans, but Ethiopia was under a hostile regime. Diplomatic channels were closed. Open immigration was impossible, so Israel launched a covert operation. Operation Moses began in November 1984. It was a secret airlift, conducted at night, using unmarked planes, through Sudan, a country officially at war with Israel. The Beta Israel walked for weeks to reach refugee camps in Sudan. Entire families, elderly, children, many died along the way. Once in Sudan, Israeli agents identified them, arranged transport, coordinated flights. Between November 1984 and January 1985, more than 8,000 Ethiopian Jews were airlifted to Israel. The operation remained secret until a leak to the press forced it to stop. Thousands were still waiting in Sudan, stranded, unable to move forward or go back. For years, they remained in limbo. Then, in 1991, the opportunity came again. The Derg regime was collapsing. Rebel forces were closing in on Addis Ababa. The government was about to fall. The Beta Israel, who remained in Ethiopia, were in danger. If the government collapsed, the country would descend into chaos. Israel decided to act. The operation was called Solomon. It was larger than Moses, faster, more urgent. The Israeli government negotiated with the Ethiopian regime. They paid millions of dollars. They secured permission for a mass evacuation. And on May 24, 1991, the airlift began. 35 aircraft, 36 hours. The planes flew continuously, back and forth. Israel to Ethiopia, Ethiopia to Israel. They removed seats to fit more passengers. They packed people into every available space. Families boarded with nothing. No luggage, no possessions, just themselves. Some had been waiting for years. Some had walked hundreds of miles to reach Addis Ababa. All of them believed the same thing. God was bringing them home. One plane carried 1,122 people. It broke the world record for the most passengers on a single flight. Another plane saw 2 births during the flight. Children born in the air between exile and return. When the last flight landed, the total was 14,125 people, airlifted in a day and a half, from Cush to Israel, from the place Isaiah named to the land Isaiah described. The prophecy did not happen in theory. It happened in real time, with flight logs, passenger manifests, photographs, video footage. The evidence is not interpretive. It is an archive. And when they arrived, they brought Sigd with them. For the first time in more than 2,000 years, Sigd was not observed on a mountain in Ethiopia. It was observed in Jerusalem. The Beta Israel gathered on the Arnon Hanatziv promenade, a hill overlooking the old city. They stood facing the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, the site where their ancestors once worshipped. They fasted, they prayed, they renewed their covenant. But the meaning had changed. For 2,700 years, Sigd had been a prayer of longing, a request for return. Now it has become a prayer of thanksgiving, an acknowledgement of fulfillment. They were no longer asking God to bring them home. They were standing in the land and thanking Him for doing it. In 2008, the Israeli government officially recognized Sigd as a national holiday. It is now observed across Israel, not just by the Beta Israel, by others who recognize its significance. It is the only Jewish holiday that originated outside of Israel and was later adopted into the national calendar. Its inclusion is not just symbolic, it is prophetic. It marks the transition from exile to return, from prayer to fulfillment, from promise to reality. The Beta Israel carried that observance for 27 centuries without wavering, and now they carry it in the land the observance always pointed toward. Today, more than 160,000 Ethiopian Jews live in Israel. They serve in the military. They work in the government. They study in universities. They live in cities across the nation. Their children speak Hebrew. Their families celebrate Israeli holidays. Their identity has merged with the national fabric. They are no longer an isolated community in the mountains of Ethiopia. They are part of the restored nation, and their return confirms something that cannot be ignored. Isaiah 11:11 is not symbolic. It is operational. The second gathering is not future. It is documented. The remnant from Cush is not lost. It is home. But the Ethiopian return raises a question. If one remnant has returned exactly as Isaiah described, what about the other 7 locations? If Cush produced a returning tribe, what about Assyria? What about Elam? What about the islands of the sea? The answer is simple. They returned too. Not all at once, not in a single operation, but across the same timeline that brought the Beta Israel home. Iraqi Jews came from ancient Assyria and Shinar. Persian Jews came from Elam. Yemeni Jews came from the Arabian Peninsula, tied to the islands of the sea. Each location Isaiah named has produced a returning community. Each movement occurred after 1948. Each wave followed the same pattern: isolation, preservation, recognition, return. The Ethiopian return is the most dramatic. But it is not the only one. It is the sign that proves the system. If one piece of the prophecy is this precise, the rest of the prophecy operates with the same precision. If the location matches, the timeline matches. If the timeline matches, the sequence continues. And if the sequence continues, the next phase is already forming. The next phase is not about gathering. Gathering is complete. The next phase is about recognition. Recognition of identity. Recognition of the Messiah. Recognition of the moment. And that recognition is beginning here inside Israel right now. Not from outside pressure, not from Christian missionaries, not from political movements, from within the Jewish community itself, from rabbis, from students, from families who have returned and are now asking deeper questions. Questions about Isaiah, sacrifice. Questions about the suffering servant. Questions about the one who was pierced. Questions that were avoided for generations. Questions that are now being asked openly. And at the center of those questions is a name. A name written by a 108-year-old rabbi in a sealed letter. A name that aligns with the prophetic structure in ways that cannot be dismissed. A name that connects the gathering of the remnant to the revelation of the Messiah. The Beta Israel returned from Cush because Isaiah said they would. The question is whether Israel will recognize the one Isaiah said would come, the one described in chapter 53, the one the rabbi identified in his final message, the one whose name is no longer hidden. One return could be a coincidence. 8 returns form a pattern. Isaiah did not name one location. He named 8. And every single one has produced a returning remnant. Not in theory, in documented movements, not across centuries, across decades, not through random migration, through coordinated airlifts, border crossings, and mass relocations that all point in one direction, toward Israel, exactly as Isaiah wrote. The list in Isaiah 11:11 is precise. Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Kush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath, islands of the sea. These are not symbolic terms. They are geographic markers, ancient names for real places that still exist on modern maps. And each one corresponds to a Jewish community that either returned to Israel or is in the process of returning right now. The pattern is not partial. It is complete. Assyria is northern Mesopotamia. The region that includes modern Iraq, parts of Syria, and sections of southern Turkey. This was the empire that destroyed the northern kingdom in 722 BC. The empire that took the 10 tribes into exile. The Jewish presence in that region continued for more than 2,700 years. In northern Iraq, the Kurdish Jews maintained communities in cities like Mosul, Erbil, and Zakko. They spoke Aramaic. They practiced ancient customs. They lived in the same areas where their ancestors had been exiled. In the 1950s, the Iraqi government turned hostile. Jewish property was confiscated. Movement was restricted. Violence increased. Israel responded with Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. Between 1950 and 1952, more than 120,000 Iraqi Jews were evacuated. Flights left Baghdad almost daily. Families boarded with whatever they could carry. Most left everything behind. They came from the land of Assyria, the place where the exile began, and they returned to Israel, exactly as Isaiah said they would. Egypt is obvious. The Jewish community in Egypt was one of the oldest in the world. Some families traced their ancestry back to the time of Jeremiah, who fled to Egypt after the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. Others came during the Greek and Roman periods. Alexandria became a major center of Jewish life and scholarship. By the 20th century, tens of thousands of Jews lived in Cairo, Alexandria, and other cities. But after Israel's independence in 1948, the situation changed. Egypt went to war against Israel. The Jewish community became a target. Businesses were seized, properties confiscated, families expelled. Between 1948 and 1970, nearly the entire Jewish population of Egypt left. Most went to Israel. Some to Europe or the Americas, but the direction was clear. The community that had existed for more than 2,500 years was gone. They left Egypt again, and this time they went home. Pathros is Upper Egypt, southern Egypt, the region along the Nile south of Cairo. In ancient times, this was a distinct area. Isaiah named it separately from Egypt, indicating that Jewish communities were scattered across the entire length of the Nile. The exodus from Egypt in the 1950s and 1960s included Jews from Upper Egypt as well. Not in the same numbers as Cairo or Alexandria, but they were part of the same movement. Isaiah's precision is remarkable. He did not just say Egypt, he said Egypt and Pathros. Two regions, both produced returning Jews. Both were fulfilled in the same time frame. Elam is ancient Persia, the region that corresponds to modern Iran. The Jewish community in Iran was ancient. It predated the Islamic conquest by more than 1,000 years. Some families traced their lineage to the Babylonian exile. When Cyrus allowed the Jews to return, not all of them left. Many stayed in Persia. They built synagogues. They established schools. They became integral to Persian society. By the 20th century, Iran had one of the largest Jewish populations in the Middle East. Then, the Islamic Revolution happened in 1979. The new regime was hostile to Israel. Jews were viewed with suspicion. Restrictions increased. Danger mounted. Thousands fled. Some went to the United States, but many went to Israel. Between 1979 and the present, tens of thousands of Iranian Jews have immigrated to Israel. They came from Elam, the exact location Isaiah named, and the movement continues. Even now, small groups still emigrate when opportunities arise. Shinar is Babylon, another name for the region around Baghdad, the heartland of ancient Mesopotamia. Isaiah used both terms, Assyria and Shinar, indicating that Jewish communities would be scattered across the entire region. The Iraqi Jewish return covered both: northern Iraq, Assyria, and southern Iraq, Shinar. Operation Ezra and Nehemiah brought them all, more than 120,000 people, from the land where the first exile occurred, from the cities where Daniel prophesied, from the rivers where the exiles sat down and wept. They returned, all of them, within 2 years. The ancient community of Babylon is now in Israel. Shinar is fulfilled. Hamath is in Syria, the region north of Damascus, near the modern city of Hamath. Jewish communities existed there from ancient times, small, scattered, but present. After Israel's independence, the situation for Syrian Jews became increasingly dangerous. Syria was one of the most hostile Arab states toward Israel. Jews were forbidden to emigrate. Passports were denied. Movement was restricted. For decades, the Syrian Jewish community was trapped. But in the 1990s, pressure from the international community forced Syria to relent. The gates opened, and between 1992 and 1994, nearly the entire Syrian Jewish population left. Most went to Israel, some to the United States. The community that had existed for thousands of years evacuated in less than 3 years. Hamath was emptied, and the remnant came home. The islands of the sea is the most flexible term. It refers to distant coastlands, regions beyond Israel's immediate geography, places accessible by sea. In ancient terminology, this could include the Arabian Peninsula, the Mediterranean islands, parts of Greece, even distant lands unknown to Isaiah's original audience. The Yemeni Jewish return fits this description. Yemen sits on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, surrounded by water on 3 sides, connected to ancient trade routes that crossed the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. The Jewish community in Yemen was isolated for centuries. They lived in conditions that resembled biblical times more than the modern world. When Operation Magic Carpet began in 1949, many Yemeni Jews had never seen an airplane, but they boarded, nearly 50,000 of them. They flew from the islands of the sea to Israel, another part of Isaiah's list, another documented return. But the pattern goes beyond the 8 locations. Communities emerged from places Isaiah could not have named because they did not exist in his time. India, the B'nai Menashe from the northeastern states. Thousands have returned since the 1990s. The Cochin Jews from southern India. Most relocated to Israel in the 1950s and 1960s. The Bene Israel from the Mumbai region. Tens of thousands immigrated after 1948. Central Asia, Jews from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan. When the Soviet Union collapsed, they moved to Israel. North Africa beyond Egypt. Morocco had the largest Jewish population in the Arab world. By the 1970s, most had left. The majority went to Israel, Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, the same pattern. Ancient communities, sudden departure, one destination. Even communities no one expected began surfacing. Groups in Peru claiming descent from Spanish Jews who fled the Inquisition. Communities in Uganda with Israelite traditions. Some have sought formal recognition and return. Descendants of Jews in Ethiopia beyond Beta Israel. Smaller groups who preserved partial traditions. Families in remote parts of China, in Zimbabwe, in southern Africa. Not all have returned. Not all have been officially recognized, but the direction is consistent. Once hidden, now visible. Once scattered, now consolidating. The movement is global. The timeline is compressed. The pattern is undeniable. And the speed matters. The first return from Babylon took decades to complete. The initial wave under Zerubbabel was followed by Ezra's group years later, then Nehemiah's, then others over the course of generations. But the second return happened within a single lifetime. From 1948 to the present is only 77 years. In that span, Jews returned from more than 120 countries. The population of Israel grew from 600,000 to more than 7 million. The majority of that growth came through immigration. Return, Not slow migration over centuries. Rapid consolidation over decades. The acceleration is a prophetic indicator. When timelines compress, something is approaching. And the consolidation is precise. The remnant did not scatter randomly into new host countries. They moved to one location, Israel, not Europe, not America, not anywhere else. Even Jews who initially fled to other countries eventually moved to Israel. Soviet Jews who went to Germany in the 1990s often moved to Israel later. Iranian Jews who fled to the United States sometimes relocated to Israel in subsequent years. The pull was directional, consistent, unmistakable. This was not economics. Many left wealth behind. This was not safe. Israel has been in a state of conflict since its founding. This was fulfillment, a movement driven by something deeper than politics or opportunity. Isaiah saw this moment 2,700 years before it happened. He could not have known the names of the modern countries, but he knew the directions, the regions, the pattern. He knew the remnant would be scattered in every direction, and he knew they would return from every direction. He named 8 locations to represent the totality of the dispersion, and all 8 have produced returning communities. The prophecy is not symbolic. It is geographic. The fulfillment is not spiritual. It is measurable. The evidence is not interpretive. It is a demographic. But the return of the remnant is not the end of Isaiah's prophecy. It is the setup. Chapter 11 does not stop at verse 11. It continues. Verse 12 says, God will assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. Verse 13 describes the reunification of Ephraim and Judah, the northern and southern kingdoms coming back together. Verse 14 describes tension with surrounding nations, conflict, pressure. Verse 15 describes a highway from Egypt, a path of return. Verse 16 describes a remnant from Assyria, the very people who are now in Israel. The gathering is not isolated. It is connected to a larger sequence. And that sequence is still unfolding. The remnant has returned. That is documented. The question now is what happens next. Because the same chapter that describes the global return also describes a figure, a root from Jesse, a branch, a king, someone who will stand as a banner to the nations, someone the Gentiles will seek, someone who will judge with righteousness and strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. Isaiah saw the gathering, and he saw the one who would be revealed when the gathering was complete. The remnant is home. The next phase involves recognition, and that recognition is beginning in the place no one expected, inside Israel itself. The evidence for the second gathering is overwhelming, but evidence alone does not lead to recognition. Recognition requires something more, a voice from within, a witness that cannot be dismissed, someone who stands inside the system and speaks with authority that tradition respects. That witness appeared in 2006, and his message changed the conversation. Rabbi Kaduri was not a marginal figure. He was one of the most respected Orthodox rabbis of the 20th century. Born in Baghdad in 1898, he moved to Jerusalem as a young man and spent the next 90 years immersed in Torah study. He was known for his mastery of Kabbalah, for his strict observance, for his humility and discipline. Political leaders sought his counsel. Prime ministers visited him. Military officials asked for his blessing before campaigns. Tens of thousands attended his Torah classes over the decades. When he spoke, people listened. Not because he was charismatic, because he was credible. He represented continuity, tradition, authority. Everything about his life pointed in one direction. Orthodox Judaism. No deviation, no compromise. Nothing in his background suggested even the slightest openness to Christian teaching. He was the last person anyone expected to identify Yeshua as the Messiah. But in his final year, something shifted. Kaduri was 108 years old. His health was declining. He knew his time was short. In the months before his death, he made several unusual statements to his inner circle. He told them he had met the Messiah, not in a vision, not in a dream. He said he met him. He did not elaborate. He gave no description. He offered no proof. He simply stated it as fact. His students were surprised. Some were confused, but they trusted him. Kaduri had spent more than a century studying Scripture. He was not given to sensationalism or speculation. If he said he met the Messiah, his students believed he had a reason for saying it. Then he did something no one anticipated. He wrote a note, a short message, in Hebrew. He told his closest students that the note contained the name of the Messiah. But he gave strict instructions. The note was to be sealed. It could not be opened until 1 year after his death. No exceptions. No early access. 1 year. He did not explain why. He simply gave the order and expected it to be followed. The note was sealed. Witnesses confirmed it. Kaduri's handwriting, his signature, his instruction. On January 28, 2006, Rabbi Kaduri died. His funeral was one of the largest in Israeli history. Estimates range from 200,000 to 300,000 attendees. Roads were closed. Entire neighborhoods shut down. The nation mourned, and the sealed note remained untouched. 1 year later, in January 2007, the note was opened. Rabbis, students, and members of Kaduri's family gathered. The seal was broken. The message was read aloud. It was written in Hebrew, 6 words, arranged vertically. When read normally, the 6 words formed a sentence about the Messiah's character and work. But Kaduri had constructed an acrostic. The first letter of each word, when combined, spelled a name. Yod, Shin, Vav, Ayin, Yeshua, the Hebrew name for Jesus. The room went silent. This was not a Christian writing that name. This was an Orthodox rabbi. A man whose entire life had been defined by strict adherence to Jewish law. A man who had taught thousands of students. A man trusted by the nation's leadership. A man who had no reason to write that name unless he believed it was true. The note did not argue. It did not explain. It did not defend. It simply identified. Immediately, objections arose. Some claimed the note was forged, that someone altered it after Kaduri's death, but the people who witnessed him write it confirmed its authenticity. They recognized his handwriting. They verified the signature. Forensic analysis was conducted. The paper, the ink, the writing style. Everything matched. Others claimed Kaduri had been influenced late in life, that someone manipulated him. But Kaduri lived in a closed Orthodox community. He did not have contact with Christian missionaries. He did not read Christian literature. He did not attend interfaith gatherings. His world was the yeshiva, the Torah, the Talmud, Jewish texts, Jewish teachers, Jewish students. If he wrote the name Yeshua, he arrived at it through his own study, not through outside pressure. Still others argued that the note was genuine but misunderstood, that Kaduri meant something else, that the acrostic was coincidental. But Kaduri was a master of Hebrew. He understood language. He understood structure. Acrostics are a traditional Jewish literary form. They appear throughout Scripture, in Psalms, in Proverbs, in Lamentations. Kaduri knew how to construct them. He knew how they worked. He knew what he was writing. The acrostic was not accidental. It was intentional. And the note was not his only statement. In his final teachings, Kaduri described patterns that would appear in Israel when the Messiah's identity became known. He spoke of 3 movements, 3 shifts, 3 changes that would happen at the same time. Not in the distant future, in the generation that would see the revelation. He said the movements would be internal, arising from within the Jewish community, not imposed from outside. And he said they would involve Jerusalem, the city, the people, the nation. When all 3 movements were active, he said the recognition would begin. The first movement, a shift in how Jews approached the question of the Messiah. Kaduri said that certain passages of Scripture, long avoided in Orthodox study, would be reopened. Isaiah 53 in particular, the suffering servant, the one who was despised and rejected, the one who bore the sins of many. For centuries, that chapter was either ignored or reinterpreted to refer to the nation of Israel collectively. The idea that it described an individual Messiah who would suffer was avoided. But Kaduri said that would change. He said Jews would begin reading Isaiah 53 again. And when they did, they would see what had been there all along. A description of Yeshua. The second movement, preparation for the temple. Kaduri thought that the discussion about rebuilding the temple would shift from theoretical to practical. He said it would no longer be treated as a distant dream. It would be discussed as something achievable within a single generation. He said vessels would be prepared, priests would be trained, plans would be drawn. And he said this preparation would accelerate at the same time the Messianic recognition increased. The 2 movements would reinforce each other. The third movement, regional tension and realignment. Kaduri said the nations surrounding Israel would organize into coalitions. He did not use modern names, but he described the structure. Northern powers aligning with regional actors. Alliances forming that would create pressure on Israel from multiple directions. He said this tension would not be random. It would follow a prophetic pattern. A pattern described in Ezekiel, Daniel, in Zechariah. And he said the pressure would not destroy Israel. It would clarify Israel's identity. It would force the nation to confront the question it had avoided. Who is the Messiah? Kaduri died before these movements fully emerged. But in the years since his death, all 3 have become visible. Not in theory, in measurable developments. The first movement is happening. Jewish interest in Yeshua is rising. Not from external evangelism, from internal curiosity. Messianic Jewish communities inside Israel have grown significantly in the past 2 decades. Groups of Jewish believers who maintain their Jewish identity, who observes Sabbath, who keeps the Torah, who affirm that Yeshua is the Messiah. 20 years ago, these communities were rare, underground, barely visible. Today, they are public, active, growing. Conferences are held. Congregations meet openly. Leaders speak on Israeli media. The question is no longer whether Jewish people can believe in Yeshua and remain Jewish. The question is how many do, and the number is increasing. Alongside this, Isaiah 53 has re-entered public discussion. Not in Christian circles, in Jewish ones. YouTube channels run by Orthodox Jews are analyzing the chapter, debating its meaning, asking whether it could refer to an individual. Yeshiva students are raising questions their teachers once dismissed. Podcasts hosted by Israelis are interviewing Messianic Jews and asking them to explain their faith. The conversation has shifted. What was once forbidden is now examined. What was once avoided is now discussed. The boundary, Kaduri said, would break, is breaking. The second movement is also active. The Temple Institute in Jerusalem has been working for more than 3 decades to prepare for the rebuilding of the temple. They have recreated more than 70 vessels required for temple service. Menorah, altar implements, priestly garments, musical instruments. These are not replicas for display. They are functional objects designed for actual use. The Institute has also trained priests, men from the tribe of Levi who have undergone the purification rituals described in Torah. They are ready to serve. They are waiting for a structure. Architectural plans exist. Models have been built. The design is complete. The only question is location. For years, the assumption was that the temple could not be rebuilt without removing the dome of the rock, an action that would trigger immediate war. But recent scholarship has challenged that assumption. Some archaeologists now argue that the first and second temples did not stand on the exact spot where the dome currently sits. They argue the temple stood slightly to the north, or to the south. If that is correct, it means the temple could be rebuilt without displacing the dome. Coexistence becomes possible. The idea is still debated, but it is no longer dismissed. The conversation has shifted from impossible to logistical. And statements from Israeli leaders have changed. In past decades, talk of rebuilding the temple was confined to fringe religious groups. Now, members of the Knesset speak about it openly. Rabbis with influence say it could happen in their lifetime. Organizations with funding and expertise say they are ready when the moment comes. The temple is no longer a distant concept. It is a present question, and the question is being asked at the same time Messianic recognition is rising, exactly as Kaduri said it would. The third movement is the most visible. The regional alliances surrounding Israel have realigned in ways that match ancient prophecies with startling precision. Russia has established a permanent military presence in Syria. Turkey has shifted from secular Western ally to Islamist regional power. Iran has built a network of proxy forces across the Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon. Militias in Syria and Iraq, Hamas in Gaza. These 3 powers, Russia, Turkey, Iran, now operate in coordination. They share intelligence. They conduct joint military operations. They align on strategic objectives. This alliance did not exist 20 years ago, but it exists now. And it matches the coalition described in Ezekiel 38. Gog, Magog, Persia, Togarmah, Gomer. The ancient names correspond to modern territories. Ezekiel described a northern coalition that would move against Israel in the latter days. That coalition is forming, not in secret, in full view. And the formation is happening at the same time the remnant has returned, and the temple preparation is advancing. 3 movements, 3 timelines, 1 convergence. Kaduri saw this before it happened. He did not predict dates. He described mechanisms. He said the 3 movements would activate together. He said they would arise from within, not from outside. He said they would point to one conclusion. The Messiah is about to be revealed. And when Israel sees him, they will recognize the one they pierced. That phrase comes from Zechariah 12:10. And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. Zechariah saw a future moment when Israel would recognize the Messiah, not as a conquering king arriving for the first time, but as the one they had already rejected, the one they pierced. The recognition would bring mourning, not celebration, because they would realize they missed him the first time. Kaduri's note points to that moment. He did not write the name Yeshua to start a theological debate. He wrote it because he believed the recognition was near. He wrote it because he saw the movements beginning. He wrote it because the generation that would see the fulfillment was already alive. And he sealed it for 1 year so that no one could accuse him of seeking attention or controversy. By the time the note was opened, he was gone. He could not defend it. He could not explain it. He could not be interviewed or pressured. The note had to stand on its own. And it does. Because the note is not the only evidence. The note is the capstone on a structure that was already built. The remnant has returned. That is documented. The temple is being prepared. That is visible. The alliances are forming. That is measurable. The Messianic recognition is rising. That is undeniable. Kaduri's note does not create the pattern. It identifies the one the pattern points to. And if an Orthodox rabbi of Kaduri's stature reached that conclusion, the question is unavoidable. What do you do with the evidence? You can dismiss it. You can ignore it. You can argue against it. But you cannot erase it. The prophecies are fulfilled. The timelines have converged. The movements are active. And at the center of it all is a name. A name written by a 108-year-old rabbi who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. A name that aligns with Isaiah 53, with Zechariah 12, with Psalm 22. A name that connects the gathering of the remnant to the revelation of the Messiah. Yeshua. The question is no longer whether the prophecy is real. The question is whether you will recognize the one it points to. 3 movements. Kaduri said they would rise together. He said they would be internal, not imposed from outside. He said they would be visible, not hidden in scholarly debates or private discussions. He said when all 3 were active at the same time, Israel would be standing at the threshold of recognition. Today, all 3 are active. Not in early stages, in advanced development, not in isolated pockets, across the nation and the region. The convergence Kaduri described is not approaching. It is here. Movement 1. Messianic recognition rising. For most of the past 2,000 years, the idea of a Jewish person believing in Yeshua was considered impossible. You were either Jewish or Christian, not both. Believing in Yeshua meant abandoning Jewish identity, converting, leaving the community. That boundary was strict, enforced, unquestioned. But in the past 2 decades, the boundary has weakened. Messianic Jewish communities now exist openly in Israel. 20 years ago, they met in secret. Homes, small rented spaces, no public visibility. Today, there are more than 300 Messianic congregations across Israel. They hold services on Shabbat. They celebrate biblical festivals. They read from the Torah. But they also affirm that Yeshua is the Messiah. Their members are Jewish, born in Israel or immigrated under the law of return. They serve in the military. They pay taxes. They participate in national life. They have not abandoned their Jewish identity. They have integrated their faith in Yeshua with it. This is not a small fringe movement. Estimates suggest between 20,000 and 30,000 Messianic Jews now live in Israel. The number grows every year. And the growth is not driven by missionaries. Foreign evangelism in Israel is restricted. Proselytizing is socially condemned. Christian groups face significant legal and cultural barriers. The growth is internal. Jewish people in Israel are encountering the question of Yeshua through their own exploration, some through reading the Tanakh, others through conversations with friends or family, others through personal experiences they describe as spiritual encounters. But the common thread is this: they arrive at the conclusion themselves, not through external pressure, through internal conviction. Isaiah 53 has become a flashpoint. For centuries, this chapter was either skipped or reinterpreted. The traditional Jewish interpretation is that the suffering servant refers to the nation of Israel, the people as a whole, suffering through exile, bearing the scorn of the nations. That interpretation has been standard in rabbinic teaching for generations, but it is being challenged, not by Christians, by Jews. Videos have appeared online, produced by Israelis, analyzing Isaiah 53 word by word. They ask questions, simple questions. If the servant is Israel, why does the text say he was cut off from the land of the living for the transgression of my people? If the servant is the nation, who are my people in that verse? If the servant represents Israel collectively, why does verse 8 refer to the servant in singular form, while my people is plural? The questions are textual, not theological, and they are hard to answer without acknowledging that the servant might be an individual who suffered, who was rejected, who bore the sins of others, an individual who matches the description of Yeshua. The discussion has moved beyond fringe websites. Mainstream Israeli media has covered it. Documentaries have been produced, interviews conducted, debates hosted. One Israeli journalist interviewed Messianic Jews and asked them to explain their faith. The segment aired on national television. Another program featured a rabbi and a Messianic believer discussing Isaiah 53 side by side. The conversation was respectful, seriously, unscripted. That would not have happened 20 years ago. The shift is not just numerical, it is cultural. The question of Yeshua is no longer taboo, it is debated, and debate creates space for reconsideration. Yeshiva students are asking questions their teachers did not expect. Reports have surfaced of young Orthodox Jews approaching their rabbis with questions about Messianic prophecies, Daniel 9 and the timeline of the 70 weeks, Psalm 22 and the details that match the crucifixion, Zechariah 12 and the one who is pierced. Some rabbis dismiss the questions, others engage them, but the questions are being asked, and once a question is asked, it cannot be unasked. The generation now coming of age in Israel has access to information previous generations did not. The Internet has made texts available, comparisons possible. Cross-references are simple. A young Israeli can read Isaiah 53 in Hebrew, compare it to the New Testament account, and decide for themselves. No intermediary required, no institutional filter. The access has changed the landscape, and the growth is not limited to secular Jews. Some of the most surprising conversions have come from Orthodox backgrounds, former yeshiva students, children of rabbis, people who were deeply embedded in traditional Jewish life. Their testimonies are consistent. They did not leave Judaism. They found its fulfillment. They did not reject Torah. They encountered the one Torah pointed to. Their stories are public, documented, verifiable. One former Orthodox Jew now leads a Messianic congregation in Jerusalem. Another wrote a book describing his journey from yeshiva to faith in Yeshua. Another speaks regularly on Israeli media, explaining why he believes Yeshua is the Messiah without renouncing his Jewish identity. These are not isolated cases. They are part of a pattern. A pattern Kaduri said would emerge when the recognition began. Movement 2. Temple preparation active. The temple has not been a realistic possibility for 2,000 years. After the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 AD, the site was left in ruins. Later, the Dome of the Rock was built. An Islamic shrine, one of the most contested religious sites in the world. For centuries, the idea of rebuilding the temple was purely theoretical, a hope tied to the Messianic age, a distant future, not a present plan. But the discussion has changed. The Temple Institute was founded in 1987. Its mission is simple: prepare everything needed for the Third Temple, not as a museum project, as a functional preparation. Over the past 37 years, they have recreated more than 70 items required for temple service. The menorah, made of gold, weighing more than 90 pounds, designed according to the specifications in Exodus. The altar of incense, the showbread table, the high priest's breastplate, the sacred garments, trumpets, harps, cymbals, instruments described in the Psalms. Every item has been crafted by skilled artisans, reviewed by rabbinic authorities, verified against biblical descriptions. These are not replicas for display. They are functional vessels, ready for use. And they are stored in Jerusalem, waiting. Priestly training has also advanced. The temple service requires priests, descendants of Aaron, members of the Levitical line. For 2,000 years, there has been no temple, no need for priests, no active priesthood. But the bloodlines still exist. Jewish families have preserved the designation. They know they are Kohanim. Descendants of the priestly line, the Temple Institute has conducted training programs. They teach the rituals, the purification processes, the sacrificial procedures. Men have gone through the training. They have undergone the ritual baths. They have studied the laws. They are not practicing, but they are prepared. If the temple were rebuilt tomorrow, there would be priests ready to serve. The most significant shift is in the location debate. For decades, the assumption was absolute. The temple stood where the Dome of the Rock now stands. Therefore, rebuilding the temple would require removing the dome, an action that would provoke immediate war, a regional conflict, possibly a global one. The idea was unthinkable, but recent archaeological studies have challenged the assumption. Some researchers now argue that the temple did not stand directly under the dome. They point to ancient measurements, water flow patterns, structural remains. They suggest the temple stood to the north of the dome, or to the south. If that is correct, the temple could be rebuilt without touching the Islamic shrine. Both structures could exist on the same platform. The idea is still debated. Not all scholars agree. But the debate itself is significant, because it moves the temple from impossible to possible, from theoretical to logistical. And public statements have shifted. In 2022, a member of Knesset from a religious party made a statement that shocked many observers. He said, "The temple will be rebuilt in our generation, not in some distant messianic future, in our generation." The statement was not condemned. It was reported as news. Another Knesset member visited the Temple Mount and publicly prayed for the rebuilding of the temple. These are not fringe figures. These are elected officials. Their statements reflect a broader shift in how the temple is discussed. It is no longer relegated to prayer books and end-time speculation. It is treated as a national project, a realistic goal, a matter of when, not if. The Temple Institute has stated they are ready. They have the vessels. They have the priests. They have the plans. All they need is the opportunity. And they believe that opportunity is closer than most people think. This is not wishful thinking. This is organized preparation, funded, staffed, documented. The second movement Kaduri described is not forming. It is formed. Movement 3. Regional Alliances and Ezekiel 38. The third movement is the easiest to see, because it is playing out in real time, on the news, in diplomatic cables, in military actions across the Middle East. The alliances surrounding Israel have realigned in ways that match the coalition described in Ezekiel 38 with precision that cannot be ignored. Ezekiel 38 names specific nations. Gog, from the land of Magog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, Persia. Kush, Put, Gomer, Togarmah. These are ancient names, but they correspond to modern territories. Magog is associated with the lands north of Israel, the region that includes modern Russia. Meshech and Tubal are areas in what is now Turkey. Persia is Iran. The name did not change until 1935. Before that, it was always Persia. Cush is Ethiopia and Sudan. The same Cush Isaiah named. Put is often identified with Libya or North Africa. Gomer is associated with parts of Turkey and Eastern Europe. Togarmah is the region of Armenia and Eastern Turkey. Ezekiel described a coalition, a military alliance, led by a northern power, including Persia and nations from Africa and the surrounding regions. That coalition did not exist 30 years ago. It exists now. Russia has established a permanent military presence in Syria. In 2015, Russia intervened directly in the Syrian civil war. They built air bases, deployed aircraft, stationed troops, provided advanced weapons systems. They did not leave when the fighting decreased. They stayed. Russia now has military infrastructure in Syria that allows them to project power across the Middle East. Naval bases on the Mediterranean coast. Air defense systems, intelligence facilities. This was the first time since the Cold War that Russia operated openly in the region, and Syria sits directly north of Israel. Ezekiel said the coalition would come from the north. Russia is positioned in the north. Turkey has shifted from Western ally to independent regional power. For decades, Turkey was part of NATO, aligned with the West, secular in governance. But under President Erdogan, Turkey has moved in a different direction. It has embraced Islamist policies, distanced itself from Europe, strengthened ties with Russia and Iran. In 2016, Turkey and Russia began coordinating in Syria. Joint military operations, shared intelligence, political alignment. This was unthinkable during the Cold War. But it is reality now. Turkey and Russia operate together. In the same territory Ezekiel described. Iran has built a network of proxies across the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, with more than 100,000 rockets aimed at Israel. Militias in Syria, positioned along Israel's northern border. The Houthis in Yemen, launching drones and missiles toward Israeli territory. Hamas in Gaza, armed and funded by Iran. Iran does not need to invade Israel directly. It has surrounded Israel with forces loyal to Tehran, and Iran coordinates with Russia. Military sales, intelligence sharing, diplomatic alignment, Persia and Magog, operating together. Exactly as Ezekiel described, Libya and Sudan have also entered the picture. Both nations have seen the rise of groups aligned with Iran or sympathetic to anti-Israel movements. Libya descended into chaos after Gaddafi's fall. Militias control different regions. Some have ties to Iran, others to Turkey. Sudan normalized relations with Israel in 2020. But the government remains unstable. Internal factions oppose the agreement. Put and Cush, both in the region Ezekiel named. Both are part of the broader coalition structure. The pieces are not scattered. They are aligned. And the alignment accelerated in the past decade. Before 2015, Russia was not in Syria. Before 2016, Turkey and Russia were adversaries. Before the 2000s, Iran did not have the regional reach it has now. The coalition forming today did not exist a generation ago, but it exists now, and it matches the description in Ezekiel 38 so closely that even secular analysts have noted the pattern. This is not speculation. This is geopolitical reality. The alliance is real. The positioning is exact. The tension is measurable. Ezekiel also describes the outcome. He says the coalition will come against Israel, but it will not succeed. God will intervene. The invading forces will be destroyed. The nations will know that the Lord acted. Israel will not win through superior firepower. It will survive through divine intervention. That has not happened yet. But the setup is complete. The coalition exists. The positioning is in place. The trigger could come at any moment. And when it does, the world will witness the fulfillment of a prophecy written 2,600 years ago. 3 movements, 1 moment. Kaduri said the 3 movements would converge: Messianic recognition, temple preparation, regional alliances, all active at the same time, not in sequence, simultaneously. That has never happened before in Israel's history, but it is happening now. Jewish people in Israel are reconsidering Yeshua. The temple is being prepared with institutional backing and public support. The nations surrounding Israel have aligned into the exact coalition Ezekiel described. 3 independent developments, 3 separate timelines, 3 unrelated forces, all converging at the same point in history. That is not a coincidence. That is confirmation. And the convergence points to one conclusion. The recognition is near. The moment Zechariah described. When Israel looks at the one they pierced. The moment Isaiah saw. When the root of Jesse stands as a banner to the nations. The moment Kaduri identified. When the name he wrote in secret becomes known in public. The movements are not building toward that moment. They are preparing the nation to enter it. The movements inside Israel do not happen in isolation. They are part of a larger pattern, a pattern that involves 3 distinct entities moving toward the same moment in time. Israel, the church, the world system. 3 hands on a prophetic clock. Each advances on its own trajectory. Each operates independently. But all 3 are approaching the same hour. And when all 3 hands converge, the moment arrives. Hand 1, Israel. Israel's position is clear. The nation has been restored. The remnant has returned. The temple is being prepared. Messianic recognition is rising. Regional alliances are forming. Every element points forward, not to a distant future, to a near transition. But Israel is not the only indicator. The prophetic structure involves more than one people group. It involves the church, the body of believers scattered across the nations. And it involves the world system itself, the governments, the economies, the structures of power. All three move together. Hand to the church. Jesus made a statement in Matthew 24 that defines the church's role in the final timeline. Verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. The gospel must reach every nation before the end arrives. Not partial reach, complete reach. Everyone groups, every language, every tribe. That seemed impossible for most of history. How could the message reach isolated tribes in the Amazon, remote villages in Central Asia, islands in the Pacific? Travel was slow. Communication is limited, access restricted. But technology changed the equation. The gospel is now accessible in more than 3,700 languages. Bible translation efforts have accelerated dramatically in the past 50 years. Wycliffe Bible Translators, SIL International, other organizations working in partnership. They have translated Scripture into languages that had no written form until recently. Tribes that were unreachable a generation ago now have the Bible in their own tongue. Digital distribution has expanded access even further. Bible apps, audio recordings, online platforms. People in restricted nations can access Scripture on their phones, in secret, without detection. The reach is global, the penetration is deep, and the pace is accelerating. Missionary efforts have shifted from Western-led to global. For centuries, missions were dominated by Europe and North America, but that has changed. The fastest-growing missionary movements now come from Africa, Asia, Latin America. South Korean missionaries serve in more than 170 countries. Nigerian churches plant congregations across West Africa and beyond. Brazilian missionaries work in the Middle East and North Africa. Chinese house church networks send workers into unreached regions despite government restrictions. The center of global Christianity has moved. The majority of Christians now live in the global South, not the West. And the energy, the growth, the expansion, it is coming from those regions. Church growth in formerly closed nations is unprecedented. Iran has seen explosive growth in underground house churches. Despite persecution, despite arrests, despite executions, estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of Iranians have come to faith in the past 20 years. Some reports put the number over 1 million. This is happening in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. China experienced similar growth before recent crackdowns. Between 1980 and 2010, the Christian population in China grew from an estimated 10 million to more than 100 million. House churches multiplied. Networks formed. Entire regions saw mass conversions. The government responded with increased surveillance and persecution. But the movement did not stop. It went deeper underground. In the Muslim world, conversions are occurring at rates never seen before. North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia. Former Muslims are coming to faith in Jesus despite the risk of death. Their testimonies are consistent. Dreams, visions, encounters they describe as supernatural. They are not being reached by Western missionaries. They are being reached directly. Digital platforms have created new pathways. YouTube channels run by former Muslims explain why they left Islam and embraced Christianity. Millions of views, thousands of comments, people from restricted nations asking questions. Telegram groups allow secret believers to connect, share resources, encourage each other. WhatsApp networks distribute scripture and teaching materials across borders. Governments cannot monitor. The gospel is moving through channels that did not exist 20 years ago, and the movement is accelerating, not slowing, not plateauing, accelerating. The question Jesus raised in Matthew 24:14 is no longer theoretical. Has the gospel reached every nation? Not fully, not yet. But the remaining unreached people groups are shrinking. Mission organizations track them. The number decreases every year. In 1974, there were an estimated 24,000 unreached people groups. By 2000, that number dropped to around 10,000. Today, it is closer to 3,000. The finish line is visible. For the first time in history, the completion of the Great Commission is within reach. Not in centuries, in decades, possibly in years. And when that task was complete, Jesus said the end would come. The church is approaching the fulfillment of its mandate. The second hand is moving. Hand 3, the world system. The third hand involves something darker. The consolidation of global power, the centralization of control, the structures that make possible what Revelation describes. A system capable of monitoring, of restricting, of enforcing compliance on a global scale. For most of history, that system could not exist. Empires were regional. Communication was slow. Control was limited. But technology has removed those limits. Global financial systems are consolidating. Banking is now digital. Transactions cross borders instantly. Every purchase leaves a trace. Central banks are developing digital currencies, CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. More than 100 countries are exploring or piloting them. China has already launched its digital yuan, mandatory in some regions, fully traceable, fully controllable. The European Central Bank is testing a digital euro. The Federal Reserve is studying a digital dollar. These are not private cryptocurrencies. These are government-controlled systems. Every transaction visible. Every account is monitored. Every movement tracked. The infrastructure for financial control exists. Not in theory. In operational development. Identification systems are becoming universal. Biometric identification. Facial recognition. Digital IDs. India implemented Aadhaar, a biometric ID system covering more than 1.3 billion people. Europe is moving toward a unified digital identity framework. Vaccine passports during the pandemic demonstrated how quickly digital verification could be deployed globally. Within months, systems were in place, integrated with phones, required for access to public spaces. The technology exists to link identity, health records, financial accounts, movement patterns, all in one system. The framework for the mark described in Revelation 13 is not distant. It is being built. Surveillance has reached levels unimaginable a generation ago. Cameras monitor public spaces in every major city. Facial recognition identifies individuals in crowds. Cell phones track location. Internet activity is logged. Purchases are recorded. Artificial intelligence analyzes the data, predicts behavior, flags anomalies. China's social credit system already uses this infrastructure to reward compliance and punish dissent. Citizens with low scores are restricted from travel, denied loans, blocked from certain jobs. The system is operational, proven, exportable. Other nations are watching. Some are adopting similar models. The capacity for centralized control is no longer science fiction. It is a policy. Global governance structures are strengthening. The United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum. These are not conspiracies. They are institutions. Institutions with stated goals of global coordination, unified response, centralized authority. The language is about cooperation, crisis management, collective action, but the structure being built is one of consolidation. Power moving from national governments to international bodies. Authority shifting from elected officials to unelected experts. The framework for a single system is forming, not overnight, gradually, step by step, but the direction is clear. And crises accelerate the process. Financial collapse leads to calls for global financial regulation. Pandemics lead to calls for global health authority. Climate concerns lead to calls for global environmental governance. Each crisis creates opportunity. Each opportunity advances centralization. Not through violent takeover, through voluntary surrender. Nations giving up sovereignty in exchange for solutions. Populations accepting monitoring in exchange for security. The system grows stronger with each step, and the population grows accustomed to it. Revelation 13 describes a system that requires a mark to buy or sell. That seemed impossible for 2,000 years. How could one authority control all commerce, all transactions, all economic activity? It could not without technology that did not exist. But now, it does. Digital currency, biometric ID, centralized databases. Every piece is in place. The system has not been activated, but it has been built. All that remains is the moment when it becomes necessary. A crisis large enough, a fear deep enough, a solution compelling enough, and the mark becomes mandatory. Not in the distant future, in conditions that already exist. The third hand is not approaching that moment. It is positioned for it. The convergence. 3 hands, 3 movements, 3 independent timelines. Israel has been restored. The remnant is home. The temple is being prepared. The church is completing its mandate. The gospel is reaching the final unreached groups. The world system has built the infrastructure for centralized control. Each hand moves on its own, but all 3 are synchronized. And synchronization is the key. Prophecy does not operate in isolated events. It operates in convergence. Multiple elements aligning at the same time. The restoration of Israel required specific conditions. It happened in 1948. The return of the remnant required Israel to exist. It happened after 1948. The completion of the Great Commission required global communication. It became possible in the digital age. The global control system required centralized technology. It exists now. Each development depends on the others. And all of them are advancing simultaneously. When the 3 hands reach the same position, the clock strikes. Not randomly, not by human timing, by divine design. The prophetic structure is not vague. It is mechanical. Pieces must be in place. Conditions must align. The sequence must be completed. And when the final piece moves into position, the next phase begins. The Bible describes that next phase in clear terms. A period of tribulation, a false peace, a leader who rises with solutions, a covenant made with Israel, a temple that stands, a sacrifice that is stopped, a global system that enforces worship, a mark that controls commerce, a deception that deceives many, but also deliverance, the return of the Messiah, the defeat of the nations gathered against Jerusalem. The recognition Jesus spoke of in Matthew chapter 23:39, when Israel says, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." The moment Zechariah described, when they look at the one they pierced, the revelation Kaduri pointed to, when the name he wrote becomes public acknowledgement. The three hands show us where we are. Israel is ready. The church is finishing. The world system is operational. This is not the middle of the timeline. This is the end of the setup. The stage is set. The actors are in place. The script has been written. All that remains is the opening of the final act. And that opening is not far. The speed of recent developments proves it. Israel was restored in a day, remnants returning in decades. Temple preparation has been active for years. Gospel reaching the unreached at rates never seen before. Technology enables control on a scale never possible before. Everything is accelerating. When prophetic timelines compress, the conclusion is near. The three hands do not need to move much further. They are almost aligned. And when they align, the world will not be ready. But the warning has been given. The evidence has been presented. The question is not whether it will happen. The question is what you will do before it does. The evidence is not scattered. It is consolidated. Isaiah's prophecy fulfilled. The remnant has returned from 8 locations, documented, measurable, complete. Rabbi Kaduri's letter, authenticated, written by a man whose credibility cannot be dismissed, sealed, opened, verified. The 3 movements, active, Messianic recognition rising, temple preparation advancing, regional alliances formed, the global convergence, synchronized. Israel was restored, church completing its mandate, world system operational. Every piece is in position. The question is no longer whether the prophecy is real. The question is what you will do with the reality in front of you. For 2,700 years, Isaiah's second gathering was dormant. It sat in the text, unmoving, waiting, not because it was unclear, because the time had not come. Then, 1948 changed everything. Within one generation, the movement began. Communities that had been hidden for centuries appeared. I am from Ethiopia. I am from Yemen. I am from Iraq. I am from India. From the former Soviet Union. All moving in one direction, toward Israel. Not slowly, rapidly, not symbolically, literally. The prophecy did not wait for interpretation. It activated, and the activation proves the system. If one part of the prophecy is this precise, the rest operates with the same precision. Isaiah did not write half-truths. He wrote a complete revelation. The gathering happened exactly as he described. The locations match. The timeline fits. The scale is global. That means the next part of his prophecy will unfold with the same accuracy. The part about the root of Jesse, the banner to the nations, the one who will judge with righteousness, the part about conflict with surrounding regions, about Egypt and Assyria, about a highway and a return. Isaiah saw the whole sequence, not just the gathering, everything that follows. And if the gathering is complete, the sequence continues. Kaduri saw the same pattern. He did not base his conclusion on Christian theology. He based it on Torah, on prophets, on texts he had studied for more than a century. He reached a conclusion that contradicted everything his community believed, and he wrote it down, not for attention. He sealed it for a year after his death. Not for controversy. He knew the reaction it would cause. He wrote it because he believed it was true, and truth does not wait for approval. The name he wrote is Yeshua. That name connects to Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, the one who was pierced for our transgressions. It connects to Zechariah 12, the one Israel will look upon and mourn. It connects to Psalm 22, the one whose hands and feet were pierced, whose garments were divided. It connects to Daniel 2, the Messiah who would be cut off after 69 weeks. Every major Messianic prophecy in the Tanakh points to the same figure, a suffering Messiah, rejected by his own people, killed, raised, returning. Not two Messiahs, one, appearing twice, first to suffer, second to reign. The Christian world has proclaimed this for 2,000 years. But proclamation from the outside does not lead to recognition. Recognition requires a voice from within. Kaduri was that voice, an Orthodox rabbi, respected, trusted, credible. He did not leave Judaism. He identified its fulfillment. He did not reject Torah. He pointed to the one Torah described. His testimony is not the only evidence, but it is the capstone, the unexpected witness, the voice no one anticipated. And when an Orthodox rabbi of his stature writes that name, the question becomes unavoidable. What if he was right? The three movements inside Israel support his conclusion. Messianic Jews are not fringe believers anymore. They are visible, growing, integrated into Israeli society. The temple is not a distant dream. It is an active project, funded, staffed, prepared. The regional alliances are not speculation. They are formed. Russia, Turkey, Iran, positioned exactly where Ezekiel said they would be. These are not coincidences. They are confirmations. Kaduri said the three movements would rise together. They have. He said they would indicate the nearness of recognition. They do. He said the Messiah's identity would become clear. It is becoming clear. Not to everyone. Not yet. But the process has begun. And the global context accelerates the timeline. The Church is approaching the completion of its mandate. The final unreached people groups are shrinking. The gospel is penetrating the last resistant regions. Digital tools are reaching populations no missionary could access. Jesus said the gospel would be preached to all nations. Then the end would come. That finish line is closer than it has ever been. The world system has built the infrastructure Revelation describes: digital currency, biometric identification, centralized surveillance, global governance frameworks, the capacity for the mark, the structure for enforcement, the technology for total control. It is not theoretical. It is operational. All that remains is activation. And activation requires crisis, collapse. A moment when populations accept what they would have rejected before. That moment is approaching. Economic instability, political fragmentation, rising conflict, global fear. The conditions are forming. Three hands moving toward the same hour. Israel consolidated. Church finishing. World system operational. This is not the middle of history. This is the transition point. The moment when one age ends and another begins. And at the center of that transition is a question every person must answer. Who is the Messiah? That question is not academic. It is not about theology. It is about recognition. Recognizing that the prophecies are not symbolic. They are literal. Recognizing that the timeline is not distant. It is now. Recognizing that the gathering has happened. The movements are active. The convergence is real, and recognizing that the one the prophecies describe has already come. Not as a conquering king the first time, as a suffering servant, rejected, pierced, killed, but raised, ascended, returning. Israel will recognize him. Zechariah says so. They will look at the one they pierced. They will mourn. They will acknowledge. Not all at once, not without resistance. But the recognition will come, because the prophecy requires it. But Israel's recognition is not the only recognition that matters. Every person faces the same question. Not whether the prophecy is real. The evidence proves it is. The question is whether you will respond before the window closes. Prophetic windows do not stay open indefinitely. The Babylonian exile lasted 70 years. Then it ended. One decree, 1 year. Done. The second exile lasted 1,000 years. Then it ended. One declaration, one date. Finished. The gathering window opened in 1948. The remnant has returned. The consolidation is nearly complete. That means the window is nearing its purpose. And when a window closes, opportunity ends. Not gradually, abruptly. The decision is not about joining a religion. It is about recognizing the one who fulfilled the prophecies, the one Isaiah described, the one Kaduri identified, the one the evidence points to, Yeshua, Jesus, the Messiah, not because tradition says so, because the text says so, not because a church teaches it, because the prophets wrote it, not because it is popular, because it is true. And truth does not negotiate. It does not wait for consensus. It does not adjust to preference. It stands. Regardless of response, the prophecies have been fulfilled. The timelines have converged. The movements are synchronized. The evidence has been presented. The witnesses have testified. The pattern has been established. What remains is a decision. Kaduri made his decision after 108 years of study. He wrote a name. He sealed it. He left it as his final statement, not as a suggestion, as an identification. The Messiah is Yeshua. The suffering servant in Isaiah 53 is Yeshua. The one Israel will recognize in Zechariah 12 is Yeshua. The root of Jesse in Isaiah 11 is Yeshua. The Son of Man in Daniel 7 is Yeshua. The one whose hands and feet were pierced in Psalm 22 is Yeshua. Every thread leads to the same name. The world is not ready for what comes next. It is not ready for the collapse that will demand centralized solutions. It is not ready for the leader who will offer false peace. It is not ready for the covenant that will be broken. It is not ready for the tribulation that will test the nations. And it is not ready for the return of the one it rejected. But ready or not, the sequence continues. The prophecy does not pause for preparation. It advances according to divine timing, and the timing is set. Israel has been gathered. The stage is prepared. The recognition is beginning. The question is not whether it will happen. The question is whether you see it, whether you recognize the moment you are standing in, whether you understand that neutrality is no longer an option. Because the prophecy is not waiting. It moved when the remnant returned. It moved when the temple preparation began. It moved when the alliances formed. It moved when Kaduri wrote the name. And it is moving now, not toward fulfillment, through it. The decision is yours. Not tomorrow, not when conditions change, not when more evidence appears. Now, because the evidence is complete. The witness has been given. The name has been written. And the clock is not slowing down. The prophecy didn't wait for permission. It moved. The question is whether you'll move with it. May 24, 1991. 35 aircraft lifted off from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. In 36 hours, they transport 14,325 people directly to Israel. This was not a military operation. This was not a refugee crisis. This was the fulfillment of a 2,700-year-old prophecy. The people on those planes were Ethiopian Jews, Beta Israel. They had preserved their identity for more than 27 centuries. They kept Torah. They observed Shabbat. They faced Jerusalem and prayed for a return that seemed impossible. Isaiah named their location, Cush. He said a remnant would return from there in the final gathering. These flights were called Operation Solomon, but they were more than an operation. They were evidence, and they were just the beginning, because 7 other groups were already moving, from 7 other locations Isaiah named. The prophecy is in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11. Most people read it once and move on, but one phrase in that verse changes everything. Isaiah wrote that the Lord would recover his people a second time, not once, twice, 2 separate returns, 2 different eras, 2 distinct fulfillments. The first return was from Babylon. That happened in 538 BC under Cyrus the Persian, documented in history, recorded in Scripture, fulfilled completely. But Isaiah did not stop there. He pointed to another gathering, one that would happen long after Babylon, one that would involve not one empire, but many nations, not one direction, but 8 locations spread across continents. He named them Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Kush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath, and the islands of the sea. 8 locations, 8 points of the compass. 8 anchors of a global dispersion. For centuries, this list seemed like ancient geography, names of places that no longer mattered. But every name on that list corresponds to a real community that either has already returned to Israel or is in the process of returning right now. That is not interpretation. That is a record. The Ethiopian Jews came from Cush, exactly where Isaiah said. The Iraqi and Kurdish Jews came from ancient Babylon and Assyria, exactly where Isaiah said. The Yemeni Jews came from the Arabian Peninsula, connected to the islands of the sea, exactly where Isaiah said. Jews from India, from the Bnei Menashe community, trace their lineage to the tribe of Manasseh, scattered into the Far East, regions Isaiah pointed to when he wrote about lands beyond Israel's borders. North African Jews returned from Egypt and Libya, ancient Pathros. Persian Jews came from Iran, ancient Elam. Each location Isaiah named has produced a returning remnant. Not in theory, in measurable movements, flights, border crossings, documented arrivals, government records, population data. This is not symbolic fulfillment. This is physical relocation on a global scale. But here is what makes the timing critical. For 2,500 years, nothing happened. The Babylonian return occurred. The second return did not. Empires rose and fell. Borders shifted. Entire civilizations collapsed and rebuilt. The Jewish people scattered further. Tribes disappeared from the public record. Languages changed. Cultures absorbed them. And the prophecy sat in the text, untouched, unmoved, waiting. Not because it was unclear, because the conditions did not exist. Isaiah described a return that required international borders, global transportation, multiple nations coordinating movement, and most importantly, a restored nation of Israel capable of receiving the remnant. None of those conditions existed in the ancient world. None of them existed in the Middle Ages. None of them existed during the Ottoman Empire. They did not exist in 1800 or 1900, but in 1948, everything changed. May 14, 1948, Israel became a nation again. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, there was a place for the remnant to return to. A government, a flag, a military, an international identity, legal frameworks, diplomatic recognition. The window opened, and within one generation, the movement began. It started immediately. Jews from Europe who survived the Holocaust, Jews from Arab nations facing persecution, Jews from the Soviet Union when the borders finally cracked open. But the most striking returns were the ones that matched Isaiah's list exactly. The ones that brought back communities no one knew still existed. The ones that proved the prophecy was not symbolic. It was a blueprint. Operation Magic Carpet brought Yemeni Jews in the late 1940s. They had lived in isolation for centuries. They preserved traditions that dated back to the First Temple period, when the planes arrived to bring them to Israel. Many had never seen an aircraft before. Some believed they were fulfilling the verse in Exodus, "I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." They boarded the planes, thousands of them, and they returned to a land their ancestors had left more than 2,500 years earlier. Operation Ezra and Nehemiah evacuated Iraqi Jews in the early 1950s. Iraq had been home to one of the oldest continuous Jewish communities in the world, ancient Babylon, the place where the first exile occurred. When Iraq's government turned hostile, Israel airlifted more than 120,000 Jews in a covert operation. They came from the land of the first captivity, fulfilling the pattern Isaiah described. Soviet Jews began returning when the USSR collapsed. For decades, they were trapped behind closed borders, prevented from emigrating, cut off from Jewish practice. Their identity was suppressed. When the system fell, more than 1 million Soviet Jews moved to Israel, the largest single wave of immigration in the nation's modern history. They came from the north, from territories that align with the ancient lands Isaiah referenced. Then there was Ethiopia. The Beta Israel community had a unique story. They were isolated for more than 2 millennia. No contact with the broader Jewish world, no rabbis from Europe or the Middle East, no Talmudic tradition in the way other communities practiced it. But they had the Torah, they had the dietary laws, they had the Sabbath, they had the festivals, and they had something else, an annual observance called Sigd. For more than 2,000 years, they gathered on mountaintops in Ethiopia. They fasted. They prayed. They renewed their covenant with God. And they asked for one thing: to return to Jerusalem. They did not pray as if it were symbolic. They prayed as if it were literal, as if one day the promise would be fulfilled and they would stand in the land their ancestors left. Generation after generation kept this observance. They faced toward Jerusalem from the highlands of Ethiopia. They waited, and on May 24, 1991, the wait ended. Operation Solomon was not the first evacuation. Operation Moses in 1984 had already brought thousands, but Solomon was